Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Oslo. Officially, the visit is centered around trade, green partnerships, and diplomacy. But beyond the headlines and ceremonial meetings, there is another reason Norway draws global attention today. This small Nordic country of just 5.6 million people controls one of the most influential financial funds in the world. Norway's sovereign wealth fund is now worth more than $2 trillion. That is close to half of India's GDP. The fund owns stakes in thousands of companies across the world, from Apple and Microsoft to Nestle and Samsung. In fact, it owns roughly 1.5% of all listed stocks globally. What makes this story remarkable is not just the size of the fund, it is how Norway built it. Most countries that suddenly discover massive natural resources go through a familiar cycle. Money pours in quickly. Governments spend aggressively. Inflation rises. Other industries weaken. Corruption grows. Economies become dependent on one source of wealth. Norway had seen this happen elsewhere. So when huge oil reserves were discovered in the North Sea in 1969, Norwegian policymakers made a decision early on. The oil wealth would not be treated like easy money. Instead of pumping all that revenue directly into the economy, the government moved cautiously. Oil companies were heavily taxed. The state kept strong control over the sector. And after years of political debate, Norway created what would eventually become the Government Pension Fund Global in 1990. The thinking behind it was straightforward. The oil did not belong only to the present generation. It belonged to future generations too. The first transfer into the fund happened in 1996. But one rule became central to the entire model. The money could not be invested inside Norway. There was a reason for that. Economists often warn about something called Dutch disease. When a country earns enormous revenues from natural resources, its currency can become too strong, making other domestic industries less competitive. Norway wanted to avoid becoming an economy built entirely around oil. So the money was invested abroad, across global markets. Over time, the fund stopped depending mainly on oil income and started growing through investments. Today, around 70% of the fund is invested in global equities, while the rest is spread across bonds, real estate, and renewable energy infrastructure. The fund owns office buildings and properties in cities like London, New York, and Tokyo. It has investments in more than 10,000 companies across dozens of countries. Unlike some sovereign wealth funds that make aggressive strategic bets, Norway largely follows a long-term, disciplined investment strategy. It buys relatively small stakes in companies around the world and holds them over long periods. That patience is what transformed the fund into the largest sovereign wealth fund on the planet. But Norway also imposed strict limits on itself. Every year, the government can spend only a small percentage of the fund, roughly 3% of its value. The larger capital base remains protected, while only the expected returns are used for public spending. That money supports healthcare, education, pensions, infrastructure, and Norway's welfare system. It is one of the reasons the country consistently ranks among the wealthiest and most stable nations in the world. Still, the model has its critics. Some believe Norway has become too comfortable relying on fund income. Others argue the country's productivity and innovation have slowed because the financial cushion is so large. There are also debates about whether the fund should take more risks or reduce its dependence on American markets. And then there is the contradiction at the center of the story. Norway presents itself as a global leader in sustainability and ethical investing. The fund avoids companies linked to tobacco, certain weapons, and serious environmental violations. Yet the wealth behind the entire system still comes from fossil fuels. Even so, decades later, Norway's strategy is widely seen as one of the most successful examples of long-term economic planning in modern history. What Norway managed to do was turn temporary oil wealth into a permanent financial foundation. And as world leaders gather in Oslo once again, that story remains central to understanding why the small country carries influence far beyond its size.